very excited because Chris is Chris has got all kinds of interesting skills in his little toolkit. So he is a hypnotist and a neurolinguistic programming trainer, so an NLP trainer. His presentation is going to be called the Win Squared process. This is his own trademark term. And let me just explain that he has worked in IT for over 20 years, most recently as a pre-sales solutions architect for an AI company. He has also done sales performance consulting for several well-known companies, including AT&T, VMware, and eBay, evaluating sales efficacy and teaching persuasion and closing techniques. So there's a job search skill that we all need. Those consulting projects conducted between 2020 and 2021 form the basis of 4 upcoming books. Number 1, Mind Leading, How to Win, Influence, and Get Your Way. Do not let your 2-year-old read that book. Number 2, The Art of More, How to Win, Influence, and Get Your Way More. The sequel. Number 3, Open to Close, How to Win, Influence, and Get Your Way in Sales. And of course, looking for a job is a sales situation, right? You're trying to persuade people to buy this product because it's superior to the other products that are available. So it's a sales situation. And number 4, Careering, How to Win, Influence, and Get Your Way in Your Career. So I think we'll be buying the set. Chris developed the WIN process, whereby in pursuit of win-win outcomes, we leverage a 3-step process to sell, persuade, and delight. I love that, the other person. And since the focus is on win-wins, we too wind up equally delighted. His website, which is subinfluence.com, has for over 10 years offered articles, ideas, and attitudes to encourage our growth and excellence in both our personal and professional lives. Without any more delay, let me just introduce to all of you, Chris Gingolph.
Thank you so much. And I got to say, there's a reason, a driver underneath all of this, including why I started to study this stuff in the first place. Many years ago, I had been working with a former college professor of mine. He'd started a company. And he had some amazing stuff he was doing in software. And yet I noticed that when he talked with customers, he just couldn't seem to connect with them. They didn't seem to care what he was saying. They didn't follow up and they weren't interested in hearing his message. And I was very curious about it. And so at one point I very carefully asked him, Mel, it seems that they're just not really getting the message. He said, exactly, they're not getting it. And I said, yeah. So I'm wondering, is there anything we could figure out? Remember, I'm just a college kid at this point. I don't know anything. And so I said, is there anything we could possibly adjust to where they would get it? And he said, well, years ago, there was a guy, Milton Erickson, he was a hypnotist, and he had some ideas about this. And then some guys came up with this idea called NLP, and they did I don't know, it's not really relevant. It's not important. And I took that and I ran with it. At this point, this is before search engines were even a thing. So I was it was really hard to find information. And so learning about it, I was sold. I said, this makes sense. And in a simple statement, NLP is the study and use of subjective experience. And subjective experience has a structure. The reason this matters is something we've no doubt seen, both when we've done something well, we've done something poorly, and we've observed it in others. I just fast forward, jumping over a bunch of years. I just had this experience a couple of years ago with a company I was working for, and I watched the salesperson. I was the pre-sales engineer, so I was the person who would have the technical conversation. But this fellow would get on there, and he had 50 slides to cover, and he was very excited about his message. He knew his stuff, and he was very excited to tell the customer all about it. Here, I'll just pour this on you, and you just sit there and tell me how brilliant I am and buy my product. And it didn't work. And I said, I have some experience in this area. I think the problem is you're not tapping into their subjective experience. He said, there's no such thing as that. It's just true or it isn't. I said, well, how do you figure? And he said, well, if it's just a better product, it's better price, it's just true, right? And I said, okay, you're talking about objective truth. He goes, yeah, exactly. It's just true. I said, well, here's the problem. We all have an interpretation of that. Every one of us. He said, well, if it doesn't, it's not that, then it's just wrong. And I said, there's our problem right there. Because the challenge is, if you want to persuade me, you want me to hire you, for example, or you want me to buy your product, even if that product is, as we elegantly stated a few minutes ago, is in fact you and your skill set for this job. One of the things you have to do is satisfy not just the objective facts of the hiring process. We need someone with X number of years of experience. We need someone with X degree. We need someone with a particular certification, for example. I've got to satisfy all those with my candidate, or else when I pass you on to the next round, it's going to get rejected. They're going to look at me and say, Chris, did you just not pay attention? Because they don't have any of the things we're looking for. So yeah, those things are important. Those things are real. And yet, once they're satisfied, now the next part that remains is my subjective experience of how right are you for this? Or if you're selling me a product, same thing. How right is this product for me? And I may not be using objective criteria to decide that. It may not be price. It may not be features. It may be just how it makes me feel about it. Now, guess who has complete influence over how it makes me feel? And that was the problem. That was what was missing, is that when we would get on a call with a customer or we'd sit in their conference room with them once the pandemic was cleared, the customer would sit there and say, okay, well, yeah, this is what I want. No, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. Hold on. I got some slides. And so I'd watch the customer slowly just tune out completely. And pretty soon they were on their phone. They were not paying any attention at all. They weren't interested. Now, what I noticed, it was funny because what I noticed was this guy would then say, he would notice they were tuning out, but he wouldn't get why. And he would just raise his voice a little bit. So now we're going to talk about this. And you notice on the slide where it says this, and the customer would look up briefly, startled, and go, oh, it's the same crap as before. And they go right back to what they were doing. And this happens in job interviews too. I've seen situations where someone is talking about their history, what they can do for the company, but they're really just cycling through conflicts they had at work, or they're just prattling on about something that the interviewer does not care about. That's not what they're needing to experience subjectively to say, yes, you need to move on to the next round. Now, there's a funny thing happened to me in the last 2 weeks, because I got laid off at the first week of January. And I just got 2 offers this last week. I've decided to take one of them. One of them was a bizarre, funny story to tell, because it illustrates how if you start to use these skills, but it's not really right for you, it's not going to be a good fit, and it won't last. Which is why when we speak, NLP talks a lot about creating rapport, and that's been so popularized at this point that we all know what that is. We all understand, well, we got to create a sense of sameness, right? So we start making stuff up. Like all of a sudden, I'm from Purdue too. No, I'm not. And yet when we start manufacturing similarities, those will backfire very, very fast. And that's one of the things that I'd say is we need to use our sensory acuity to notice the commonalities that are there and focus in on those and start connecting it to the other person's subjective experience. Because in the course of this weird interview I did, it was funny because it showed that when I just used the skills I have, I wasn't manufacturing anything. In fact, I concluded at the end of each interview, I'm not right for this. And so first interview happens, the recruiter has explained they're looking for a Google Cloud professional specialist in WAF. And I said, okay, I know that really well. Yeah, we can do that. And so went into this interview and there were 4 guys rapid fire asking questions. And I thought, well, this is a fun technique. Okay, this is either to hypnotize me, which it will do, or to throw me off and see how well I handle pressure. Let's have fun with this. So in talking with them, I started to notice a pattern. 2 of the guys in the call were asking questions that had nothing to do with the topic at all. And finally, at one point, I stopped it and I said, can I please ask you guys a question? My understanding is it's for this role. Can you please explain why we're talking about this other stuff over here? And they said, oh, we're interviewing you for 2 roles. I said, okay, well, just to be honest with you, I prepared for one, and it's this one, and I'm not really. And they said, no, but you're doing fine. Keep going. I'm like, okay, that's already a red flag for me. And I'm concerned, but I'm thinking, okay, why is this working? I went, oh, it's the hypnotic language patterns. Okay, I'm using things that give them a sense of I understand, and yes, I'm right for this. This gives me responsibility to rein that in and get very specific. Because if I get myself into a situation where I'm really not the best fit, they'll eventually find out and waste everyone's time. Or worse, I'll get the job and I'll be treading water trying to freak out how to stay afloat. And that's a terrible situation. I mean, yes, I'm a big fan of learning myself, but you want to be successful. So we got out of that call, and I talked to the recruiter. I said, "Hey, this is not making sense to me. They're also looking at me not just for this other technical role. They're looking at me as a product manager, and I'm not qualified for that. Just I'm not." And he said, "Well, but they said you did very well at it." And I said, "No, I didn't. They had an experience that I did very well at. Objectively speaking, I did not, and they just didn't notice that." And so in the course of that, he said, "Well, let me get some feedback from them." Came back and said, "They loved you. They want to do a second round." I said, "Oh, well, this is just weird. Now I'm just curious. I want to see what happens." So I said, "Okay, can you tell me what the topic will be?" He said, "Probably both roles again." Okay. So I went in that, and it was totally different. Now it was entirely about cloud security in general. I thought, all right, well, I know most of the major clouds, so I could probably hang with this conversation. I still don't know that I'd be the right person for it, and I'm going to figure that out and say so. But we went through that. It was a disaster because they started asking really weird, idiosyncratic questions I didn't even know I answered. And I answered a bunch of them just from what I knew from prior experience, but I don't think I was specific enough to be useful. And yet we came out of that one with an interesting person attended. It was someone who was the manager of my recruiter. So he actually shadowed the whole thing. And I was relieved to see that. So I thought, okay, it's not just me. I'm not just crazy. And sure enough, they called back and I said, "Well, that was a disaster." And he said, "What are you talking about? That was awesome." What are you talking about? It was terrible. And he said, "No, they're very excited. They want to put you in front of a customer." I said, "What are you talking about? That's insane." And he said, "They want you to do a presentation for one of their customers." I went, "Oh, okay. Well, this makes no sense because it was a disaster." I said, "You were on the call. What did you actually think?" He said, "It was amazing. You nailed it." I said, "I really didn't." He said, No, you did. You did. We all agreed you did." I said, "Okay, this is a problem. Something is happening here in my communication that's getting across to them that's not real. And I got to be really cognizant of that and be more disciplined about that." So I thought, well, what exactly, this is probably a mock thing. This is someone just pretending to be a customer and they're just going to do a role play and see what happens. I thought, okay, this, if nothing else, could be fun. At this point, I'm pretty confident I'm not going to take it. But I'm thinking this could be fun just to see what happens. We went through the thing, and it turns out it was a real customer. I thought, who puts an applicant in front of a real customer? This company is not one I want to be associated with. They have no concept of how to execute all the way through. They offered me the job, but I actually got to the end of the what I thought was a role play. And I said, "Now you have the experience of knowing this is right for you. Are you ready to take action now? Or do you want to wait until you get a little more information? Do you need pricing?" And the customer said, "Yeah, as long as it's in line with the pricing we've seen so far. Yeah, can you get us a quote?" I said, "Well, I'm not the right person to get you the quote, but I'll talk to your account executive and make sure you get the quote." And here I'm thinking it's a role play. So I'm just playing along with it. And we got off the thing, and the recruiter said, "Oh my God, they're so excited. You just closed the deal for them." I went, "What?" I said, "Okay, full stop. We need to know what's actually going on here. Was that an actual customer?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why would you do that? Why would they put an applicant?" He said, "Well, they were so impressed with the way you did the first interviews." I said, "It was 2 interviews and they were a disaster." He said, No. My manager said the second one he attended was fantastic." I went, "Okay, let me pull back and evaluate this and get really, really honest about this." I thought, this is the problem. I utilize the way I communicate to sell it, to convince them it's right, thinking it was a role play, and it turns out it actually happened. But that's the point at which you need to step back and say, okay, this isn't correct for me to do. It's going to waste everybody's time. So I'm going to pull out of this. And next time, ask a lot more aggressive questions. Because ironically, the first company I applied for is the one that's made the other offer. And that one actually fits. That actually makes sense. And so I'm going to take that one. But this one was just bizarre to me that it worked. And as I evaluated it, I realized that's what it was. That objectively speaking, I didn't match their criteria at all. And they somehow threw all that out and they paid attention only to their subjective experience of it. I said, okay, well, this can be very powerful and also very dangerous. So we want to be very cognizant of what we're doing. There is a process, a 3-step process to persuasion in this regard, what I call win squared. And the reason I call it win squared is, as mentioned earlier, it's win-win. If you convince me to hire you, You don't just get the job. I look good to everybody else. They say, wow, you found this amazing candidate for us. This person's working out amazingly. So I look great. And the company, of course, also benefits because they have a great candidate doing great work and they're profiting from that. So the concept of the win-win is really important because too often, and I still run into it, even now, I run into salespeople who don't understand that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not that I get the sale, I take their money, and then who knows how it goes for them in the future? Who cares? Because I got the deal. That will absolutely get you out of business. You will not be in that line of work very long because people remember. And I had a situation to demonstrate that pretty profoundly about a year ago, where a customer I'd worked with at F5 Networks several years ago, about 5, 6 years ago, contacted me out of the blue because I haven't changed this phone number in forever and said, hey, Chris, I need advice on this product. And I said, well, I don't actually sell that anymore. And he said, yeah, I know, but I really need your opinion on which one's the right one for me. And I said, okay, well, I'm a little curious as to why you're asking. And he said, well, I know that you're curious enough about this technology to keep up with it, so you'd still be able to give me good advice. And I know you won't bullshit me. And I went, really? He said, yeah, if it's not right, you'll admit it. So how did that factor into your decision to call me? He said, because I need good advice. I need it to be honest. I need to know that I can trust it. I thought, oh, this is what they mean about trusted advisor. Okay. And so I said, well, I'm really humbled by that. And since I don't feel technically proficient enough to answer that question, I'll tell you my opinion, but I think you should speak to a colleague of mine who actually does work in that specific segment. He said, oh, I'd appreciate that. That turned into a win-win on 3 levels because the customer got the product they needed, my colleague got a sale, and I got a massive dose of that's the way you do it. So it was really pretty remarkable. But that's the type of thing we want. We want when the customer evaluates the decision or when the hiring manager evaluates their decision to hire you, they look back at, this is what I call the decision review. They look back at that and go, that was a damn good choice. I did great there. This has worked out really well for me. And that process is important because if it turns out that wasn't a good match, they're going to be very wary of you in the future. They're going to be very suspicious of you in the future. I've seen that happen where I won't name names, but there is a company that has a reputation for doing just that, burning bridges everywhere they go, just to satisfy this quarter at the absolute expense of the subsequent quarters. And the problem with it is customers caught on and they went, oh, we're not trusting them anymore. They're going to tell us whatever we need to hear to make the sale. And we can't trust them at all. And that's it. They're toast at that point. We as professionals are the same way. Our reputation precedes us and it follows us. So whatever we do in one situation, people are going to hear about again. So that's the type of thing when we talk about making sure when I start to build persuasion for someone else, I make sure it actually makes sense. I make sure it's true and it's something they're not going to regret. So that's what we mean about delighting the customer, delighting the other person. They go, that was a great choice, an awesome choice. So that's a term I call for this understanding I'm talking about is as we speak about subjectivity, I want, or let's put you in that role. Let's say you want to persuade me as a hiring manager, for example, that you're the right candidate to move forward in the process. So you want to understand how I'm going to decide that. Too often, this is where subjectivity gets slippery. Too often, we as people will just assume that everyone thinks as we do. We'll project onto them how we would do it. And we just figure, well, everybody would do that because it's more or less an objective truth, right? But in truth, that's not how it ever works. So if you, for instance, say, the thing he's going to care about is that I'm really punctual and that I'm a hard worker and I'm going to put in extra hours after hours. And let's say for me as an HR professional or as the hiring manager, I really like work-life balance and I don't trust people who are workaholics. It makes me very uncomfortable. And so I look at that and say, hey, what are your hobbies? Oh, my hobby is excelling and kicking butt and getting in there and putting in extra hours. And it just drives me, gets me really excited. It sounds good to you, perhaps. But for me, I'm going, oh, this is going to be a burnout in 6 months. Yeah, this is not going to work for me at all. And so, but as you start to inquire of me, not just asking me overtly, but that's important too, about paying attention to my reactions, calibrating changes in my physiology, my tone, when you say specific things. Some things are obvious. Like you say, for instance, yeah, I'm one of those people, I'm always here on weekends and I'm busting button. And I go, ooh. Right there, you should have caught that. It was pretty obvious. But I've seen things where The tells are very, very subtle, but they're always happening. I call them invisible channels of communication. They're always occurring around us. And the more of them you begin to notice, the more power you have in the situation. Because once you start to notice what's going to make me choose you, you know what to say, you know how to package the information. But also remembering what we mentioned a few minutes ago, if it's not a good fit, if I say, for example, we need somebody who does this and this and this, and you go, oh, I hate that stuff. That's definitely not stuff I enjoy doing. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good fit. But if it is a good fit, and you go, excellent, let me go ahead and present myself in the best possible light. Let me understand what Chris, as the hiring manager or as the HR professional, is looking for. How is he going to have an experience of, I'm perfect for this? How is he going to feel that internally? Because the cool stuff you have in your resume is awesome. That got you this far. But I need an experience that you're perfect for this. And at the risk of self-aggrandizement, I had an experience. I have a good friend of mine who's still a mentor to me in many ways. And he was one of the people who hired me at Trustwave. I went through a battery of like 5 or 6 interviews, and that was one of them. And he told me at one point, once we become good friends, he said, you know, I got to tell you, Chris, you were the best interview I've ever given. He said, I never interviewed you. He said, no. I mean, when I interviewed you for the job, it was fantastic. You were amazing. I said, why? And he couldn't tell me. He came up with a lot of generalities like, well, you really seem to understand things, and you just felt to me like you'd be perfect for it. And I went, oh, I know what happened. I decided I was right for it, was perfect for it. And I went on to that third part, which is to sell it, to actually persuade. And I said, Victor, do you want to know how I did that? Would it ruin it for you if I told you how? He goes, what do you mean you did it? I know you did it. I said, no. There's a process I used, and I do it all the time. And remember when I talked about NLP? This is how I used it in that situation. And he laughed. He said, oh my gosh, I feel so funny. I never caught that. And I said, well, it's a subjective experience. We don't catch it usually. If we're subtle and we're skillful, we use it stealthily and with respect, because we're not trying to harm the other person. They're not going to have a reason to go back and be suspicious of us or distrust us. In his case, he'd known me since then about 10 years, and never once had he had an issue. Never once had he suspected I actually created that feeling in him. But that's what we have to do. We have to understand this person across the table or across the desk or across Zoom is going to be making a decision about me based on what they feel. Now, how are they going to make that decision? As you begin to learn that, you begin to glean it from me, that's what I call radical understanding. It's where you start to grasp me on a level. Now, this is, by the way, not just useful in persuasion overall. When people perceive that you're paying that close attention to them, when people perceive that you're like them and you really understand them, it's an amazing feeling. It's a connection most of us don't get very often. Even with a loved one, a partner, very rarely does that happen a lot. So when they get that feeling with you and they just met you, there's this sense of, wow, okay, there's really something here. There's something powerful about this person. I want to get to know them. I definitely want to hire them, but I want to make sure I want to be their friend. I want to learn from them. I want to figure out what makes them tick, because man, there's something about them. And so that's the type of thing that I was sharing with Victor, my friend. And that's the challenge, is to make sure we understand it's not all in us. In fact, persuasion never happens within us. It's always in the other person. So as you begin to learn about what it is that I'm looking for, you do the second step, which is asking yourself very honestly, can I deliver that? Is that what I have to offer here? If it isn't, it'd be a mistake to go on, which is the reason that I found with that interview I mentioned that no, this is not right at all. I'm stopping right here, because this is just one of those things. But if it is right, you then use your skills to persuade and sell. And selling is a really important skill, because persuasion is always going to be a factor. And we mentioned earlier, 2-year-olds, God's honest truth is your 2-year-old is probably already a masterful persuader. Children are excellent at this. So what we end up doing is we unlearn it over time. Now it's time to relearn. Now it's time to learn how to master this. So we care a great deal about what the other person's experiencing. And we therefore learn, what are those buttons? Where's their control panel? How do I influence them, have the experience I need them to have? And because I know I can deliver. So as the person who's the gatekeeper is interviewing you, and you give them that experience of, wow, this person's going to be amazing. I can hardly wait for you to talk to the next person, because this is going to be great. and they're enthusiastic. They're a champion for you. They're not just somebody who lets you through the gate. And so once you've done that and you continue to have that experience with each subsequent interview, at that point, you've got a whole group of people who are so excited about bringing you on board. You're in a good position. And I base that on what's actually happened in the last 2 weeks, because the one I've chosen, my only hesitation was that they're offering a salary that was a little lower than I wanted. And so I was a little reluctant. And when I talked with their HR person about it, I said, well, this is where I've been, and I'm a little uncomfortable going down that low. Is there anything you can do? And she said, well, let's just continue the process and we'll see what we can do. They ended up offering me 30% more than they originally told me they would. And I was quite happy with that, because at that point, they were actually in the lead as far as everybody else. So, but this was something that I wound up realizing I influenced that. It wasn't just classic negotiation, because that was the full extent of the talk about money. I actually spoke with her about value. I spoke with her about how she perceives value and how she looks at me and feels this way. Oh, wow, I'm almost pull out a blank check for this person. And that's the type of feeling she got. And that's why that happened. So understanding everything I'm saying here is learnable. Everybody who's ever done it has learned to do it. Little kids may master it just by trial and error, but we quickly forget it. We're taught with manners not to influence. And now at this point, we have to understand, in a crowded workplace where there's a lot of uncertainty, what sets us apart is that we can influence, is that we can persuade, and people will want to work with us to get us on board because of the fact that they see the value to them. Does anybody have any questions so far? No questions. I see somebody who's waiting in the waiting room. Just admit them. Well, the next thing I want to talk about is, what are the specific techniques? And so with regards to, has anyone ever heard of neurolinguistic programming before?
Yes, but I know you.
Well, the thing, NLP is interesting in that because it's focused on subjectivity at its core, and it's one of those things that a lot of people have a slippery grasp of what it is. And so what I noticed was when I did my first training cycle, I noticed that there were a lot of people who got very, very technical, and they wanted to impress you with how brilliant they were with all this technical jargon. I mean, it was transderivational search and specified outcome qualifiers. It was like, what the heck? And it was before I understood this was really just so they could be specific about what they were discussing. It wasn't to just wow me. But the problem I noticed was when you have an experience of it, because my first full battery was with the co-founder of the techniques, was Richard Bandler. And one of the things he told us was interesting was, yes, you're getting your trainer certification today, but I want to emphasize the certificate isn't what makes you valuable. It's that you can do it. He said, if somebody left right now before getting the certificate, but they mastered this stuff, they're going to be just as valuable out there as the person who has the certificate. Because anybody who wants to see your certificate is just asking to be hypnotized. Because it's just one of those experiences where I'm going to tell you exactly what my criteria are. Please satisfy these criteria, and I'll stop thinking critically at all. And that's part of the challenge. So in a situation with a crowded field also of trainers, I found there were only a handful of them that I really, really was impressed with. And some of them are excellent, absolutely world class. And one of them, Tad James, actually just passed away last year, but the guy was a genius. He developed the concept of timeline therapy, which is one of the things that I actually use for helping people, customers, for example, to get around to inoculate against buyer's remorse. So if I say, for example, I want you to think about a decision that you're looking at. You want to go ahead and decide if you're going to hire me or not. And I want you to imagine what it will be like, let's say in a week, when everybody's patting you on the back saying, hey, he's doing a really good job. He's learning all our stuff really well. And you have that experience of how that's going to feel. And then I say, how about in a month when they're going, wow, that guy's really rocking it. This is fantastic. This is awesome. Great choice. And you're feeling pretty good because the kudos are flowing your way. Now, this is all happening in your subjective experience. This is in your imagination. This isn't happening in reality yet. But let's say we go a year, 2 years into it. I've been promoted a couple of times. Everybody's really ecstatic with these big deals we've brought in. And how do you feel now? And they say, yeah, I was one of the people who chose that guy. At this point, they now have an experience as though it's already happened. We trust our own experience. We trust our gut. But if we've seen something happen, we're really convinced it's real. We're really convinced it's objectively true, even if you just had it in your imagination, which is why visualization works so much, which is why guided rehearsal works so much. And so in this situation, as you timeline it out for people to actually have the experience of it and actually future pace it out into the future along that timeline. Now, consider this. What if when you're talking with someone about the interview, you're in the interview setting, and you start to recognize that they are going through probably dozens of applicants, and they're going to have some good experiences and some bad ones. What's going to set you apart, because we're already assuming you satisfy the objective criteria, what's going to set you apart is the experience you give them. So again, that's the part we're after. We're after making sure that they experience you as being amazing. Obviously, if you don't have the qualifications, that's not going to last very long because no one's fooled forever. But the point is to use every advantage you have, every skill you have to close that deal. And then if it was the right choice, which I'm trusting it would be, they're going to be thrilled with it. You're going to be happy with it. So in a situation with that company I mentioned was all over the board, I looked at that and said, okay, well, I was just curious. I kept going because I was just interested in seeing what was going to happen. But the truth is, I wasn't qualified and I wasn't going to do it. And so I then said, I appreciate that. It's very kind of you, but I think there are other people better qualified for that than I am. Because it's not that I was talking myself out of something. I just knew I wasn't the right person for that. And so at some point, everyone will figure that out. And then now I'm out of a job again. So that wouldn't make a lot of sense. Now, I considered the layoff experience itself, which of course nobody enjoys. I considered all the things that take place in that, in our subjectivity, all the things like the frustration, the anger, how could they do that to me? All that stuff, the reactions of, well, what am I going to do? How do I need to respond to this? That's a really powerful point, because if you decide, well, let's see, what can I do with this? That's when you start coming up with answers, because the unconscious has a funny way of always answering the question you ask. So if you ask a question that's really high quality, something like, how can I turn this into $1 million? How can I turn this into an amazing new opportunity? Your unconscious is going to start searching for answers to that question. And you're going to start noticing bizarre, uncomfortable, and some eureka moments as answers where you go, wow, that would actually work. Okay, I might just want to pursue that. Whereas if you ask a poor quality question, something that limits you, like, how could this happen to me? Or how could they do this? It's going to come up with answers. And the answers may be very unsatisfying. And it's doubtful they're going to actually inspire you to action. Doubtful it's going to inspire you to make a change. So the key is to manage your own process internally as well as the other person's process as best you can to influence it, but to keep yourself in top form so that you're ready for every opportunity. And when you do encounter something frustrating, like you could say, well, obviously this stuff doesn't work because you got laid off. Well, stuff's still going to happen. There's just no way around that. If you walk in front of a truck, it doesn't matter how many degrees you have, you're probably not going to make it. And that's just the reality of it. So we need to understand when stuff happens to us, we need to figure out how we want to handle it, how we want to address it and respond to it. Now, for some people, it's how can you survive it? And that's not a bad question. It's fairly limited, because it just means that best case scenario is you survive, which sounds pretty good until you realize, wait a minute, if there's a storm at sea and you think, oh gosh, how am I going to make it to keep from sinking? Maybe if you do everything right, you won't sink. But what if you realize, hey, if I harness this wind and I hang on tight and manage the rudder really well, maybe I can actually reach my destination faster, actually leverage this challenge. And that's the type of thing we're talking about, is how do you manage your own process at that point, so that when you're in these settings, when you're in an interview setting, when you're facing a challenge like a layoff, when you're facing any kind of obstacle in life, you have control over what happens next, because you're the one who's going to act on it. And whatever you do is going to have a reaction out there. Same with subjective experience with other people. When you're talking with them, anything you say and do with them is going to have an effect on you. And the question is, what effect do you want to have? And so if you think of the things that might make it useful to you, things like curiosity and interest, how would I make this person curious about how I can make them help them in their job? how can I make the company better off? How can I help them to succeed? And so I noticed that when I started saying things like that, looking forward to learning more about how I can help you to reach the next level. I got much better results then. I'm excited because this looks like this might be a great job for me. Because the focus is now on them and how to help them. Once they've decided you're their champion, they're very eager to become your champion. So looking for ways to do that. Now, one of the ways we do that as well is finding the commonalities you mentioned about. We mentioned that when we go into a state of rapport, there are a few things most people don't realize about it, and very few people teach it. I've noticed this, and I do an exercise in my practitioner certification class, that I noticed that when you're in a state of rapport, you tend to become very interested in what the other person is saying. You don't just like them, you just don't just become curious about them, but you actually pay better attention. So I do an exercise in which I will break people into groups, and I will say, person A is going to be the one who's going to speak, and the person B is going to be the observer, just listens and responds. And then there'll be an observer who just takes notes and pays attention to what's going on there. And I'll ask them, first, I want you guys just to go down this quick list of topics and decide on something you agree about very vehemently or very solid in your agreement on. And pick a couple things that you absolutely are diametrically opposed on. You can talk politics, religion, whatever it is that's going to really set things on fire. Now, let's do this. Let's take a topic where you disagree completely. And let's say the first person begins speaking about their opinion on them. The natural tendency for us is to go immediately out of rapport. It's visual. You can see it right away. It's like crossing arms, look away, not interested at all in what they're saying because they're so wrong. I know I'm right and they're just totally off. Now, the observer captures all this data because most of this in our subjective experience, we won't notice. Then we switch. We switch to a topic where actually, better yet, we say we're going to go on to another topic we disagree about. And first person is going off on all the things that they think about this. And the other person is actually coached at that point. Instead of doing what comes naturally, pace them, pace their physiology, not mimic, but mirror. Start nodding in time with them, breathing at the same rate. Start looking for the commonalities in your physiology and make sure you start to reflect those back to the person. What will inevitably happen is the second person will not necessarily come to agree with the first person because they still disagree objectively on this thing. He knows it's wrong, but he will actually pay attention. And when asked afterwards, what was his position and why did he believe that? The first scenario, they rarely can. They just state the first thing they disagree about, and he doesn't remember anything else. The second one, they generally remember the details of why they disagree. And that was interesting because this is all about listening. And so then you take it one step further, and this is the part you probably have seen before. You take it where you have the person stay in rapport and begin to lead them by introducing ideas that can persuade the other person. But even better, when you take a topic that they do agree upon, but you instruct the second person, the listener, to actually break rapport intentionally, because organically we tend to do it. We tend to go into rapport with people that we agree with. We're having a good experience in the conversation. We tend to, I get what you're saying. And we tend to match that. We tend to naturally do this. But with that, of course, exactly what you'd expect. There's a good amount of understanding. There's no confusion about the points and the reasons they feel the way they do. But here's the fun part. And this is the part that I like to teach people because it's so important and most of us don't notice it. When you already agree, but you break rapport, you break that connection, you send the person's unconscious the signal, I don't agree with you. I think you're wrong. Nope. And even if you actually do agree. This is where you talk to couples and they say, yeah, he doesn't see things the way I do. He doesn't experience things the way I do. He's totally wrong. Well, I'm right about this. And when you talk to them individually, you find out they actually agree on it. And this is what's happening. And so in an interview, in a job setting, when you're talking with customers, your boss, you start to notice if you start to lose connection with the other person, even if you actually agree with what they're saying, you'll get to where not only are you sending them a message that you don't care and you're not interested, and they therefore decide they don't like you either, but you're going to notice that it's harder to pay attention. It's harder to notice these things. Achieving radical understanding becomes much, much harder to do You have to consciously focus on every detail, possibly even take notes just to capture it. So simply using this natural process and managing it carefully so that you get all the information you actually need is something that, again, is so often overlooked. I've watched so many salespeople lose deals or almost lose deals because of just that, where there was no disagreement. The customer got the message. They understood, yep, that product would be really great for me, it'd be awesome. But the salesperson had a totally different way of approaching it. They weren't managing the energy of the room, so to speak, the same way the other person wanted it managed. They weren't physiologically in sync. And so eventually the customer just decided, maybe not, and actually pulled away from it. And at that point, when I've been present to watch this, if I have the leeway to say something, at that point, I'll typically intervene and I'll change the energy. So that's part of what you guys can start doing and start learning to influence that energy back to where it needs to be to make it a successful communication, successful interview, successful meeting. And so I've had this happen where a customer is definitely pulling away and they made it clear there were certain things they cared about. The salesperson wasn't talking about those things, had his own agenda. And at that point, I just said, can I ask a question as the kid in the room who knows how to set the clock on the DVD player? And generally it'd be like, oh, I remember DVD players. Yeah. So yeah, mine always was blinking 12, 12, 12. I said, that's all it really is. I'm not any smarter than anybody here. I just have paid attention to different things. And so this may be something that might be useful. I don't know. You tell me. At that point, I've gotten permission to say something. And then I say to the customer, it sounds to me like you're saying this matters to you. The customer goes, exactly. Kind of like, finally, somebody was paying attention to me, which is strange because I know the salesperson was paying attention. He just was sending him the invisible channels of communication. Like, yeah, I don't care. Yeah, my ideas are better. My agenda is the only important one. But the customer now has an experience subjectively of, yes, someone understands me. I said, okay, so if I'm understanding that correctly, and I know that's what you, salesperson, was trying to do. So if we can focus it back in on that, would that be of interest to you? And the customer said, exactly. And that's actually where we're being able to make sure we kind of guide those, shepherd those conversations back to where they serve us and the customer and the interviewer, whomever it is you're speaking with, can be so critical. So in the course of doing that, one of the things I observed is some people have such a canned pitch for how they like to talk about things. There's actually a line in a story in my book about a student of mine who did a really funny thing. He was talking about how he was frustrated because he found he wasn't getting offers. The first interview would go really well, and then oftentimes it would just kind of stall. And so it was in a class setting. We had like 20, 30 other people in the class. And I said, can you explain what you're doing? And he said, well, I even tell stories. And you say to tell stories. I tell them a story every time, and it just seems it doesn't work. I said, well, can you tell us one of those stories? I mean, imagine we're a panel of people who are interviewing you, and we like to hear one of your stories. And he said, well, I like to make sure they know that if I'm not right for the job, I won't do it. And I said, okay, tell us the story. And he said, well, okay, role play. Okay. So anyway, I just want to let you guys know that as I'm looking at what you're doing here, as I'm looking at what I can do, if I'm not the right person, I'm going to say so. In fact, it happened just last week. I went, oh boy, here it comes. I can feel this. And he said, yeah, the customer said to me, the interviewer said to me, yeah, these are the things we want to do. And I looked at it and said, yep, I'm not the right person for that. I'm just not the right person for that job. And notice when I did that earlier, I did it with the recruiter. I didn't do it with somebody I wanted to continue on with. What he just did was an embedded command. It's something where he actually instructed them on what to think. So if I look at you and I say, in that situation, not this one, but in that situation, I just wasn't the right person for it. Maybe some other guy would be better. Maybe somebody else is better qualified. I'm definitely wrong for this. Okay, we got that right, because that's what I'd say if I wasn't right. But of course I am. By this time, they now had an experience of, oh, he's not right for this job. I'm glad we just made that decision and made it simple for me. And I just looked around and I saw light bulbs over everybody's head. And I said, does anybody want to tell him what happened? And so when people say, you just told them not to hire you, just told them you weren't right for the job. And the guy said, no, I was very clear. That's what I said in another situation, not this one. And actually, one of the students, I was really excited because they were actually able to explain to him fully what you're getting, which is, no, you took the situation as a big frame over this present moment, and you gave that little embedded command right in the middle of it that was relevant to the situation. They generalized it and they decided you weren't right for the job. And he said, no, I don't think that's real. And I said, here's something. I did a very similar thing back to him, and I won't go into all of it now. But he then started to understand. And I said, if you want to be successful at something, you have to verify all the specific objective skills you need that you've mastered them, all the things they're looking for, you truly have. But then you need to verify with the person you're talking with, do I truly know what it is that you need to see for me to advance? Once I understand that, I now position it, I pitch it that way so that I know you're going to have that experience and say, and I typically would do that at the end of interviews. I would say, and I just want to verify because for me, this feels right. And I want to make sure that I've successfully communicated my value to you. And I'm just curious, is there any point I haven't covered sufficiently to make you feel, here's the command, I'm perfect for this job? And at that point, I will have occasionally someone will say, well, yeah, we really didn't talk about this. Could you elaborate a little on this? But most of the time they go, no, that's awesome. It's perfect. I'm going to recommend you for the next round. And that's the type of thing to understand, to use these things carefully and effectively instead of shooting ourselves in the foot. So, and that's something that happens so easily. It's something that happens so effortlessly without understanding what we're doing, that it's something to start becoming cognizant of right now, so that you can be effective in persuading others and in selling yourself into the role. So as you go into every situation with a new person, the first thing you likely want to do is understand them, which for some people is very foreign. For a lot of people, the first interest is, I need to broadcast my interests. I need to broadcast my value. I need to tell them all about what I want to tell them about. And this, by the way, is not a very good person in a relationship, personal as well as professional. Your first task as a persuader is to say, only way this is going to be a true win-win, only way it's going to be win squared, is if I know what the other person actually needs to see and experience to feel that this is right. If I don't know that, I'm just taking guesses. And that's all it really ever can be if you don't know that. So the first step is going to be to evaluate, what is this person looking for? What do they need? The second is to very honestly answer for yourself. Do you have that? Can you deliver that? And once the answer comes back yes, then, because if it isn't, you can ethically exit the conversation and introduce them to someone else, or just apologize for taking their time and say, I'm going to save you some more time because I just decided I'm not right for this. But if you can deliver that, then you use your persuasion skills to actually close that deal. And that's something that I put a lot of premium on. And too often, though, when people teach persuasion, they focus only on that last piece. But if you don't really know what the person actually is going to need to see or experience, what their criteria are to choose you, you're guessing. And maybe sometimes you'll guess right. A lot of times you won't. So all three pieces are critical. And I don't see a lot of people talk about that in teaching this stuff. Even though there's some basic pleasantries and platitudes that go along with that, like, ask them what their buying strategy is, ask them what it is they're looking for, that type of thing. But there's not an intense desire to know. Curiosity that says, I've got to know. This person stands between me and the next step I want to follow. So I need to know what it is that's going to make them get me through. In fact, not just let me through, but guide me through. Because that'll often happen once they're convinced you're right and you make them look good. So that is, again, something that very often I see in sales situations that just doesn't happen. And in hiring situations, it doesn't happen. And it was really funny because once the guy in that class actually understood that he was actually telling people he wasn't right for it, and that's why it never went on, it's funny because all the other students were explaining it to him and he finally got it. And he realized, oh, wow, nailed this. I don't have this problem anymore. So manage carefully the messages you're sending, whether those messages are verbal or whether they're unconscious, whether they're physiological, whether you're unplugging from the person and turning away and not expressing curiosity and interest in them, or whether it's something very overt you can manage very easily. But anyway, there was something that I noticed when I was at Trustwave. The way it worked was that as a sales engineer, which is my title at the time, as a sales engineer, is you'd be assigned to a territory, and I had a very large territory, a central region. I had 3 account executives I worked with, But the way it worked was the other two regions, Pacific and Atlantic, had their own respective SEs. And when one of them would go out on PTO or was overloaded, they could pull you out of the pool, so to speak, by looking at your calendar, saying, Chris is available, Tom's available, whomever, Sally's available, so let's get them on this call. And one of the things my boss noticed was I was on a lot of calls, and not because my AEs were extremely aggressive or really pushing deals. It's because I was being pulled into a lot of things that were on the West Coast. And what had happened was one of the SE on the West Coast had gone on PTO for a week, and I'd done a lot of fill-in meetings for him. And those AEs started pulling me in anyway, even when he was back. And I noticed this because I went from doing 3-4 calls a day to like 5 or 6, and then it would actually go higher than that. I'd have people saying, okay, well, I need you at that time. What can you do to make me available? I'm sorry, it's already locked in. But I asked one of the AEs about it. I said, I really appreciate this and I'm grateful, but I want to understand better. Why are you bringing me in on this when your person is actually available? And she said, you ask the tough questions, but you ask it in a way that doesn't upset me. And I went, okay, that's just something that I've always done. And I said, well, can you give me an example? She said, yeah. She said, you always get out of them, whether they have budget, whether there's an incumbent solution we're replacing, whether they're even enthusiastic about doing this, or even if it's the time to do it. And I said, oh, that's true. And she said, but you always do it in a non-confrontational, non-threatening way, which is what I said, okay, thank you for that. And at one point, my boss called me and said, hey, Chris, you have like a 90% utilization rate. And for what you do, that's not supposed to be that high. You're supposed to have bench time where you're learning the new stuff. And I said, yeah. And I explained to him what was going on. He said, no, I know why. I know what's happening. He said, and I even wanted to know why they were doing this, why they were pulling you in. And I said, yeah, I just asked Amelia about that. And she explained it to me because I didn't. And he said, yeah, I asked her and she said the thing about finding out their budget. And he said, can you tell me why you do it that way? I said, sure. So, Mr. Customer, let me just ask you real quickly. We're talking about managed firewall services. Is this something that you're looking at to do this quarter? Or is this something maybe you're doing for budgetary purposes for next year? Is this maybe something end of year you want to accomplish? Can you please tell me? And the reaction I'd almost always get is, I'm not really comfortable telling you that. Yeah, you're starting to sound like a pushy salesman. I don't want to tell you that. And what I would say is, I appreciate that. And I probably would say that at first I would say the same thing you just did if I were in your shoes. But here's my reason. I'm taking some of your time right now. Your time is valuable to you. And out of respect for you, it's valuable to me by extension. So what I want to make sure is I utilize your time well. Because here's what's going to happen. I'm using timeline here at this point. 6 months from now, you're going to look back at our conversation. And you're either going to say, dang it, that guy totally wasted my time with something that I didn't care about. Or you're going to say, he just really respected my time. He made sure we stuck to things that were pressing for me. And he went, I never thought about it like that. So what you're saying is, and he was waiting for me to answer. And I said that if this is an urgent thing that you need to do this quarter, let's talk about it. Let's go on it right now and let's go in as much depth as you want. We can start setting up a POC for you ASAP. If this is for budgetary purposes, you and Amelia can talk about it at your convenience whenever you want to. I don't need to talk with you. I don't need to take any more of your time. He went, I never really thought about it like that. Okay. Yeah, this is something we needed to have done last month. This is really pressing. We need to do this like right now. So, okay, so it's okay to talk with you about this. He said, absolutely. Tell me more. So then I started asking other questions like, is there a budget for this? Which most customers at that point are like, whoa. First tell me what it's going to cost me. I don't want to be telling you whether I have a budget for it yet. Give me some pricing and I'll tell you. But I've done it the same way. I've said, here's my reason. If we're talking about, you walked into a car dealership and you say, oh my gosh, I want that top of the line model with every bell and whistle. That's what I want. But it costs $100,000. Do you have $100,000 you want to spend on this? Not do you have it, but do you want to spend $100,000 on a car? Because if you don't, if you actually say, no, I don't really want to spend, I want to spend about half that on this car. And you go, okay, well then we probably shouldn't talk about this particular model because I know for sure they're not going to budge below a certain point. It's a waste of your time. And I'm not going to try and pressure you into something you just don't want. And so at that point, they're going, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Because truthfully, if you start asking me about a service that is outside your planned budget, I'm wasting your time and mine. And I want to be respectful of all of them. So there's always a way to present these things. And it happens the same way in interview settings. always understanding how is it going to be non-threatening, but they're going to become comfortable sharing information with you, the information you need, by the way, to go on. So it's that type of thing. But at that point, he said, okay, well, I really don't want you taking more West Coast calls unless there's a need to. But that makes sense to me. He said, I'm thinking that at our next team meeting, I want you to teach that. Yeah, I want you to present that. And I said, okay, happy to. And so in the very same way as you begin to pay attention to all the details around you, all the things you can work with, you start finding new possibilities, new opportunities that just didn't seem to be there. There are details that really could surprise you. If you start noticing as the things around you, start looking a little closer and asking questions, you're going to start observing things. I had a situation, without too many more stories, a situation where I was asked as a new hire to go along, and it was mainly to shadow and learn from the smarter people. And to go along and observe what they did and how they did it. This large petroleum company had decided, we don't want to have 20 of your salespeople coming out at different times of the month or quarter. We'll bring our key decision makers to your office in Chicago, and we'll let you do your dog and pony show for us. And what we like, we'll tell you we like, and what we don't, we'll tell you that too. And so he said, I want you to attend this and just take notes and give me feedback. I said, okay. So I went and took notes, and I was very interesting because as I was watching the physiology of each of these people, calibration is the word that NLP uses. When you start to notice the distinctions between one moment and the next, when you've done something. So when you take an action and someone reacts visibly, that's where you can say, oh, that had an effect on them. Okay. And as I learned more, I started to decide, what was that effect exactly? So I was sitting very close to one of the managers from this company who was making decisions as to what to pursue and what not. And I was watching him very, very closely. And so at the end of the meeting, I took all my notes, I emailed them to my boss, I fly home. And by the time I got home, he said, these don't make any sense at all. I said, how do you mean? He said, what do you mean their pupils dilated? And I said, well, when we're excited about something, our pupils tend to dilate. When, some things we already know, they're really obvious. But somebody does this, all of us know the person is now withdrawing from us. They're not as interested in what we're saying. But some are much more subtle. And it's easy to mask this. If I don't want you to know that I've lost interest in what you said, I'll know not to do this. But things like that, skin flush, when my pores change, these are details that you can see when you're there if you're paying attention to them. And as you start to learn more of this, you'll get really good at it. It becomes automatic. You won't even notice the subtle distinction consciously. You'll just unconsciously understand what it means. And so the beautiful part was I was saying, this is why I know that this is going to happen. And this is why these product lines, they're not interested in. They're going to be wasted. And he said, that doesn't make any sense because one of the managers who was there said it was a total bust. They didn't like anything. I said, I put money on it. I saw what I saw. I'm confident that they're excited about these things. And it turned out to be right. And he asked me to teach that as well. So it was that type of thing that comes from paying attention to the other person instead of staying caught in ourselves. When we stay in here, this isn't where persuasion is occurring. When you're interviewing with me, my decision as to whether you go forward or not is based on how I experience things. And you can influence that because for the most part, I don't even know you can. So once you take control of that, you have massive power. But that's the core of what I teach. And the critical thing for people to understand is if it's not a win-win, if it's not a true win squared, the person will regret it. They'll reach what I call the decision review and they'll say, oh, that was a big mistake. Oh, that's not something that was a good idea at all. That was a total bust. I've worked with people like that. Actually, it's funny, at the last company I was with, there was a new salesperson who was brought on and I didn't want to see him waste a bunch of money on rental cars and stuff. So I figured, I'm in town. I'll just pick you up at the airport. No big deal. And first day we sat down and talked, he looked at me and he said, hey man, did you see our number? I said, yeah, 20 million. I mean, notice the difference in the subjectivity here. It's like terror in his eyes. And his voice was shaking. I never had a number that big. I don't think I can do that. And I said, you can do it. And just imagine, timeline, just imagine as you do it. Once you've done it, how amazing you're going to feel. What are you going to do with that commission check? What are you going to do with all those accolades from your boss? What are you going to do with all the younger salespeople going, oh my gosh, that was amazing. Teach me. How amazing is that? He's, I don't know, Chris. I don't know. And I remember thinking, yeah, he doesn't have the hunger. He doesn't have the faith in himself. he needs a little more confidence. That can also be developed, but you have to want that. So again, all this is stuff that you can learn. All this is stuff you can develop and practice over time and get really, really good at. And by the way, the reason that as mentioned earlier, this has become 4 books is that all this, I say all, most of this stuff is available if you study neurolinguistic programming. And yet that was developed primarily to model therapists. So if you go back through the classic NLP books, you're going to see how to become a great therapist. You're going to learn how to use these skills to help people psychotherapeutically. And they're very, very effective that way. But the structure of it, the structure of how they did that is applicable to anything. And that's the part. But there's a little extra thinking to do at that point. You got to start applying. Well, how would this apply to a sales tool? How would this apply to a job interview? And you can come up with the answers, absolutely. But I remember one of the things I looked at, I said, I love this stuff, but man, it's really something. If somebody could just make this a little simpler and more specifically applicable, I would really appreciate that. And several people have tried, but as somebody who's been in NLP for a long time, I've only seen a couple that blew my mind. That is like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. One of them is called Hypnotic Language by Michael Burton, John Burton. I'm sorry, Michael Bodenheimer. But that is an incredible book in hypnotic language, and so I recommend these when I encounter them. But there really wasn't an overall persuasion book that was really masterful. It really nailed it. And so I set out to write one. And I realized quickly this is going to get too long because I don't want to do more than 80,000 words for a book. That's a lot for someone who's busy. It's got something they're trying to achieve. That's a lot for them to consume at one time. So I thought, let's break that into 2 pieces. And then I was talking with a colleague about it. He said, you know what? If you could directly apply this to sales, I'm like, oh, of course. So that's what I started doing. So that one's actually almost done. But then the last thing was really coming about when we did a round of layoffs at that company back in November. And I looked at the decisions they were making and I thought, I don't think these were good. And I wasn't involved in those, but I was thinking, these are not good decisions. This is very short-term thinking. And companies that make short-term decisions don't tend to last. They don't tend to survive those mistakes. And so I looked at that and I thought, wow, what would I have done differently? What would I have advised my clients in the past to do differently? And I started coming up with those answers and I went, how would I as an employee see this? And how would I interpret this? And I thought, it costs $15,000 every time an executive goes to Dubai. I would cut that out until we're actually profitable. I would cut those trips out. And I started looking at all the things they're doing. I thought, yeah, this doesn't make sense. They're going to have to do another round of layoffs. So I actually saw that coming. I didn't expect it to be 2 months later, but I knew they were going to have to do another one just to be able to keep everything even. And so I thought, all right, I need to probably start paying attention to this. So I started writing a book on that, on how to spot this stuff and how to respond, how to make yourself as resistant to it as possible, because you can't absolutely guarantee it will never happen. How to make it really unlikely that it will affect you that way, so you won't be blindsided. You'll already be preparing, which I was. I was actually already interviewing, and so that was something that made a lot of sense. And then, of course, when the next round did happen, I was included. I was like, well, thank goodness I already was doing this. And I took my own advice, and it fortunately wasn't very long. So, and that's in IT where there tends to be a pretty long hiring cycle. The interview cycle tends to be pretty lengthy because typically it's 4 or 5 rounds of interviews. And so it's not quick in most cases. So it had to have started sooner. But that's the point, is to figure out how the other person needs to evaluate, how they're going to decide and influence that if this is the right choice. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question. Darla had pointed out something when you were talking about your time is valuable, what's your budget? And she said that's very similar to the question you get when you're looking for a job about salaries. And these days, generally you have that salary conversation at the beginning of a job search, essentially the screening interview, and they say, what kind of money are you looking for? You say, well, does the company have a budget for this? What's the budget? It's very similar language to what you were using, and I was surprised that it sounds as though in the job that you just accepted, you didn't have that conversation until after the job was offered, which sounds like the olden days.
Yes.
And then they made the offer. You said, I'm so excited. This sounds like a perfect opportunity, but I was making this and the salary is so much lower. Is there some wiggle room? did that in your situation, did that salary discussion, did it just keep getting postponed, or what happened with that?
Yeah, thank you for that, Kathy. That was a good question. The what I typically do initially is just to screen out things that don't make sense, is to cover it up front. And I'll typically not start with a hard line about I have to make this much money. And I'm always really honest about it. It's like, listen, this is where I've been. This is where I really want to stay right around here. And now human capital means something to me. You can tell I'm in a home office right now, and I've been working from a home office for about 10 years. So it's not a pandemic related to thing. And so it's just the companies I work for, Trustwave, Dell at one point, F5 Networks. These companies really valued the idea of having skilled people in the field they could deploy to customer sites, but not have to pay the overhead of giving them an office or a cubicle. And so that's something that's very familiar, but that to me is a big deal. So if somebody says it's in office 5 days a week, it's like right there, that's a little less appealing to me. And it's always been a little less appealing to me. I'm a divorced guy. I don't have kids, but I got 2 dogs. I had a very old cat who passed away a few months ago. I didn't want to be away from them for a long period of time. Now, in case of a business trip, it's just not avoidable. You just have to do it. But I didn't like the idea of going to an office and having water cooler chats and things like that every day. I didn't want to do that. And so I've made it clear that, this is where I am, this is where I want to be. But also I've got some wiggle room based on the fact that human capital matters to me. If you can offer things like that, and I'm not talking about free lunches catered at the office. I'm not talking about that stuff. I'm talking about things that really matter to me. Remember, subjectivity. Once you know what actually matters to me is going to make a difference, that's a big thing. Because I had, I was at I won't name them because it's going to make them look really bad, but I was at a sales kickoff for one company several years ago, and they did a skit during the thing to entertain all of us and to definitely get the message across to us. At this point, my wife at the time was really unhappy that I was always away from home on these trips. And so they did this skit in which one of the executives was at his daughter's wedding, and they were playing along like you were getting ready for the wedding to begin. And he gets a call, and it's the office saying, we've got this customer in the office and they're on the edge. They won't pull the trigger. They won't go for it. We need you. And he said, no problem. I'll be right there. Honey, I'm terribly sorry, but work needs me. Boom. And everybody's laughing and cheering, going, yeah, team spirit, awesome. And I was horrified. I went, oh my God, I don't belong here. I need to get out of here. This is going to cost me my marriage. It did. But this is not a healthy thing. And so by explaining to them up front about the human capital and what that matters, and to go specifically to your question, Kathy, I had that conversation with the recruiter beforehand saying, listen, I want to be clear. If it violates all these criteria, there is no chance I'm going to say yes. I've got some ability to negotiate on some of these points, but if you're not willing to do all these things, it's just, I'm going to actually get to the point where you're ready to make the offer, or they're ready to make the offer. I'm going to say thank you, but no. And I've actually had that happen where someone has gotten me to that point saying, yes, we need you to move to Ohio. We'll give you 2 months to get there. And no, we don't pay relocation costs. We'll reimburse you up to I think it was $2,500. I said, from Texas, moving an entire home to Ohio, which I wasn't going to do anyway. Are you serious? And they said, well, yeah, because job. And I said, yeah, that's not what I agreed to. I agreed to remote from Austin, and I agreed for X number of dollars, and they really lowballed on the salary too. I thought, guys, that's not what you agreed to. I said, well, we kind of assumed since you talked to the customer, they actually made a mistake. They actually the recruiter had me talk to the customer to interview with them directly. I did the process we've been talking about, made the customer really want to hire me, and they were super excited. And then when they came back with all those numbers, they went, no, not with the terms you just stated. And the recruiter actually said, well, you can't pull out now. The customer really wants you now. I said, we had a deal and you violated it. So I am taking that as my exit. Sorry. And so having that conversation with the first point of contact and saying, just so we're on the same page, these are the things I do. These are the things I know. And this is the value I bring. And for that, this is what I expect to receive from you as you're part of the deal. Is that comfortable for you? Is that something you can do? Because if it's not, I don't even want to do it. I don't want to persuade you to do something we can't comfortably do, because it will normalize. I was at Dell when they did 2 salary reductions across the board. and it was normalizing salaries. And I had negotiated a much larger package than I was supposed to get. I know that. I knew that going in. But when you negotiate something that you really should not get, they figure it out. And at that point, that gets corrected. So you don't want that to happen to you. So by saying up front, is this a comfortable thing for you? Or is this in a range of possibility for you? If the answer is, well, no, that's really more than we can do, or those terms are not comfortable with us. We really want someone in the office all the time. You're going to travel X number of hours a week.
Uh-oh.
Not going to happen. So, and so by covering,
You froze.
I'm sorry.
He's fine.
Okay, but that was the thing. I cover that ahead of time just so no one's blindsided by it. And as the conversation goes on, yeah, I won't hit hiring managers and technical interviewers with salary because they don't even know, and they're not supposed to talk about their own salary. So it's typically not something I would do. But when we get to the HR conversation where they're actually talking about the viability of it, then it's appropriate again to go into it and say, so what does this actually entail? What does the package look like for someone in my position? And then they start talking about that. And it's like, listen, what's the range you have? How high can you go on this? Because you start to elicit that kind of information, and this goes back to some of the skills we talked about before. When you use radical understanding to really glean from them, even the information they don't want to give you, then you start to realize, okay, there's a definite possibility here that this is outside of what they can comfortably do. So at that point, it's time to say, and I actually did this. I did that with the company I've just accepted. I'd said, well, because of where I've been and the amount I've been at, I took a pay cut to go to this company because I really wanted to be immersed in AI. I really wanted to be total immersion in that, and I got that. But I didn't expect to stay at that level forever. So I think that this is probably not the best match because I know I bring value. And I know with what you've described you need, I can say with absolute certainty I can deliver that. And I already given her that experience, so she knew that. And so that's where the subjectivity starts to work in your favor. But I got to be honest with you, I don't think I'd be comfortable with that. And so she said, well, let me see what I can do. I went, oh, okay. And it took them about a week to go back and figure out what they were willing to do. And I know for any of you who've been involved on the other side of this, like, well, we just looked at the paperwork and said, sure, we can approve that, but let's let him squirm a little bit. Let's see what he does. And I didn't. I was actually doing other interviews. And when they came back with that, it's like, it's beautiful. And I even was playing with the idea of countering again. I said, man, that'd be just too much. I wouldn't do that because I was happy with it. But again, that conversation is something that you want to cover up front, just so you know you're not wasting everyone's time. Because I've had this happen. You probably all have had this happen where a recruiter contacted you with something. It doesn't really sound like it's something you could do, but it's not something you would choose to do. This happens in IT all the time where, I mean, if you look at my resume, I've got things that I could technically be a network administrator. I could be a network engineer. I could be firewall administrator, but those are a lower pay grade than what I've been doing. So I know just by virtue of that, it's probably not a good idea to enter into that conversation. And so, but I'll test it every now and then. And sometimes they surprise me and say, well, what's the salary on this? Oh, it's not a salary, it's a contract. And I go, oh, okay, well, then that's probably not something I want to do. I've done contracts in very specific ways, but it's for a very finite period of time training. And that's not what you guys are offering. You want me to do a task in technology, and it's just not something you do. But early on in the conversation, making sure it's even viable, because sometimes it just isn't.
Yeah.